Book 2, Chapter 19 of Red Masquerade. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Annapurna. Red Masquerade by Louis Joseph Vance. Book 2, The Lone Wolf's Daughter. Chapter 19, Unmasking. One more instant the girl rested passive in uncomprehending astonishment. Then abruptly she exerted herself to break free from the supporting embrace, but found the effort wasted for lack of opposition, so that her own violence sent her reeling away half a dozen paces, to bring up against the desk, while Lanyard, making no move more than to drop his rejected arms, remained where she had left him, and requited her indignant stare with a broken smile of understanding. A smile at once tender, tolerant, and sympathetic, with a little quirk of rueful humour for good measure. "My father?" Sofia repeated in a gasp of disdain. "You?" He gave a slight shrug. "Such, it appears, is your sad fortune." "A servant?" "And not the proud prince you were promised? Rather a come-down, one must admit." Lanyard laughed low and moved nearer. "I'm sorry. I might be, for myself too, if Nogam were less a fraud than that pretentious mountebank, Prince Victor, or, for the matter of that, if you were as poor of spirit as you would seem on your own valuation, if you were not at heart your mother's daughter, and mine, my child by a woman whom I loved well and who long ago loved me." He paused deliberately to let her grasp the full sense of his words, then pursued. "It may help you get your bearings to know that I am truly the Michael Lanyard to whom Messieurs Secretin and Cipher addressed their advertisement. You remember? As this should prove." He offered a slip of paper, and after another moment of dumb staring the girl took it and read aloud the message which Victor had dictated following Sophia's flight to him from the Café des Exils. "To Michael Lanyard, Intelligence Division, the War Office, Whitehall." "That is to say," Lanyard interpreted, "of the British Secret Service." "You?" He bowed in light irony. "One regrets one is at present unable to offer better social standing. Tomorrow, it may be, but who knows?" Sophia shook her head impatiently, and in a murmur of deepening amazement resumed her reading of the note. "Your daughter Sophia is now with me. Your own intelligence must tell you nothing could be more fatal than an attempt to communicate with her." To the interrogation eloquent in her eyes, Lanyard replied, "Dictated by Victor de Carslake, who passed it on to me, the night he brought you to the house from the Café des Exils." "You knew? You, who claimed to be my father, yet permitted him?" "You were in the house before I knew I had a daughter. Carslake had no chance to consult me before fetching you. Furthermore, if he had hesitated to carry out Victor's orders just then, not only would he have nullified all our preparations to secure evidence enough to convict the man, or at least run him out of England." "Prince Victor? What was he doing that you should—" "Dabbling in all manner of infamy, from financing a thieves' fence to organizing an association of common criminals to bring it business, from maintaining a corps of agitators to foment social discontent to fostering this last, most imbecile scheme of all, which comes to naught tonight, an attempt to overthrow the British Empire and set up in its stead a Soviet England, with Victor Vassilyevsky in the dual role of Trotsky and Lenin." The girl made a sign of bewilderment and incredulity. "What are you telling me? Are you mad?" "No, but Victor is. Mad with lust for power, insane with illusions of personal aggrandizement. You don't believe? Listen to me, then. Appreciate to what demoniac lengths he was prepared to go to flatter his insane ambitions. Sturm has invented a new poison gas, odorless, colorless, the most deadly known, and easily manufactured in vast quantities by adding simple ingredients to ordinary illuminating gas. Fanatic Bolshevist that he was, Sturm offered his formula to Victor to be used to clear the way for social revolution, and Victor jumped at the offer, has spent vast sums preparing to employ it. His money paid for the recent strike at the Westminster works of the Gaslight and Coke Company, by means of which Victor was able to smuggle a round number of his creatures into its service. His money has corrupted servants employed in Downing Street, the Houses of Parliament, in the homes of the nobility, even in Buckingham Palace itself. Men ready at a given signal secretly to turn on gas jets in remote corners and flood the buildings with the very breath of death itself. And that signal was to have been given tonight. Well, it will not be. But could any scheme be more grotesquely diabolical? Do you ask more proof of the man's madness? Do you require more excuse for my permitting you to be deceived by Victor for a few weeks, rather than wreck our plans to frustrate his, when all the while Karslake and I were near you, watching over you, learning to love you? He in his fashion, I as your father, and both ready at all times to die in your protection, if it had ever come to that. Lanyard had drawn so near that only a few inches separated them, and had his voice in such control that at 3 paces distance a vague and inarticulate murmur at most might have been heard. But in Sofia's hearing his accents rang with passionate sincerity, persuading her against the reason which would have rejected his indictment of Victor as too fantastic, too imaginative, and too hopelessly overdrawn to be given credence. She believed him, knowing in her heart that he believed his statements to the last word, and knowing more, that he was surely what he represented himself to be, her father. Inscrutable the processes of human hearts, even as from the very first Sofia had instinctively, yet unconsciously recognized the intrinsic falsity of Victor's pretensions, so now she perceived the integral honesty that informed Lanyard's every word and nuance of expression, and accepted him without further inquisition. To his insistent, "Have I made you understand?" she returned a wan wraith of a smile, pitiful with entreaty, while one of her hands found the way to his. "I think so," she replied in halting apology. "At least, I believe you. But be a little patient with me. It is all so new and strange, what you tell me. It's hard at first to grasp. There's so much I must accept on faith alone, so much I don't understand." "I know." Lanyard pressed her hand gently. "But try to have faith. I promise you it shall be fairly rewarded. Only a little longer now, an hour or 2 at most, and Karslake will be here to prove the truth of all I have asserted. You will believe him, at least." "Of course," the girl said simply. "I love him." "You knew that?" "I guessed, and I'm glad for both of you." "But he is safe?" Sofia demanded in sudden access of alarm so strong that her voice rose above the pitch of discretion. "Quietly." "Yes, he is safe enough." "You know that for a fact? How do you know?" "I've seen him tonight, talked with him, not 2 hours since." "You've been in London?" she questioned. "Tonight?" "Rather. Victor sent me." Lanyard laughed lightly. "You didn't know, of course, but well, I gave him reason to suspect me, so he sent me up to be assassinated by XXII. As it turned out, however, Herr Sturm most obligingly understudied for me. Before coming back, I looked Karslake up. He'd been busy, playing a lone hand ever since Victor trumped up an errand to keep him out of your way all day. No need to go into tedious details. I found Karslake had matters well in hand. The gasworks surrounded by a cordon of troops, the house under close watch, and, best of all, a sworn confession from an Irish member of Parliament whom Victor had managed to buy, with a promise to free Ireland once Soviet England was an accomplished fact. So I left Karslake to wind up loose ends in London and posted back with my heart in my mouth for fear I'd be too late." "Too late?" Sofia queried with arching brows. "Need I remind you where we are?" A sweep of Lanyard's hand indicated the boudoir, and Sofia started sharply, in perplexity and alarm. "Where we are?" she echoed in a frightened whisper. Of a sudden memory returned of what had passed in that room before Lanyard had revealed himself to her, and knowledge of her peril, so narrowly escaped, drove home like a knife to her heart. "What am I doing here?" she breathed in horror. "What have I done?" Nothing more dreadful than prove yourself as true as you are fine, by revolting in the end against the most powerful force known to man, the force of suggestion implanted in hypnotism. You couldn't know that it was hypnotic, not natural sleep you passed into last night, when Victor tricked you with that damned crystal. Or that while you slept he willed you to do here tonight what, when it came to the final test, your nature would not let you do. "But he so often told me I had the instincts of a thief." "So often, I know, that you were, against your will and reason, by dint of the very iteration of it, coming to accept that lie as a truth, whose power there was no contesting. That is why, that you might prove yourself by your own acts, I had to let you undergo your ordeal here tonight, only standing by to make sure no ill came of it. Otherwise you might have carried to your grave the fear instilled into your soul by that blackguard. But now you know he lied, and will never doubt again, or reproach your father for the dark record of his younger years." He checked, lifting hands of desolate appeal, then let them fall. "Dear, if you knew, you would not judge me harshly. If only you could know what I have fought up from, a foundling without a name, abandoned in a third-rate Parisian hotel, reared a scullion, butt and scapegoat, with associates only of the lowest, scullions, beggars, pickpockets, Apaches, and worse. As if that mattered!" The girl turned a softly suffused face with shining eyes to Lanyard's. Now at last she knew him. Now the romance of her dreams of yesterday came true. Through the mean masquerade of Nogam the man emerged, identifying himself in her sight unmistakably with that splendid stranger whom she had never quite forgotten, since that old-time afternoon when she had met Karslake in the Café des Exils and talked so intimately of his antecedents, hinting at a history of youthful years strangely analogous with her own. Involuntarily her arms lifted and settled upon his shoulders. "I am so proud to think—" A shrill scream drowned out her words, a woman's voice ranging swiftly the staccato gamut of terror and cracking discordantly on its most piercing note. Then, with a bang that shook the flooring and must have been heard in the furthest corners of the house, the bed-chamber door was slammed behind their backs. But beyond it the screaming went on in volume, imperceptibly muffled by its barrier. One ear-splitting caterwaul following another with such continuity that the wonder was where Lady Randolph West found breath to keep up that atrocious row, and whether any dozen women of average lung power could have rivalled it. In one sharp movement Lanyard and Sofia disengaged and fell apart, their eyes consulting, hers in dismay, his in mixed exasperation and remorse. "I ought to be shot," he declared bitterly. "Who knew better? To have delayed here, exposing you to this danger." "It couldn't be helped," Sofia insisted. "You had to make me understand. Besides, if I hurry back—" In quick strides Lanyard crossed to the corridor door, unlatched and opened it an inch, peered out and gave the sum of what he saw in a gesture of finality. Then, leaving the door ajar, turned swiftly back to the girl. "Too late," he said. "They're swarming out into the hall like bees. In another minute—" Of a sudden he closed with Sofia, roughly clasping her body to him. "Struggle with me," he pleaded. "Get me by the throat. Throw me back across the desk." "What do you mean? Let me go." In answer to her efforts to wrench away, Lanyard only tightened his hold and swung her toward the desk. "Do as I bid you. It's the only way out. Let them think you heard a noise. Got up to investigate. Found me here rifling the safe." "No," she insisted. "No. Why should I save myself at your expense? Betray you, my father?" "Then give me the obedience of a daughter, or let Victor succeed in branding you a thief, the daughter of a thief." He stilled the protest she would have uttered by placing fingers over her lips. "Listen." In the corridor an angry rumour of voices, alarmed calls and cries, with thumps and scuffles of hasty feet, In the bedchamber the shrieks persisting without the least hint of failing, as a damned soul might bawl upon its bed of coals. "Sophia, I implore you." Still she hesitated. "But you—" "Never fear for me. Remember, I'm of the Secret Service. 2 minutes after I see the inside of the nearest police station, I shall be free, and happy in the assurance that your name is without stain. Then Karslake will come for you, bring you to me. Now!" Lanyard caught the girl's two wrists together, and throwing himself bodily backward across the desk, carried her hands to his throat. With a simultaneous crash, the door was flung back to the wall. Led by Victor Vassilyevsky, a dozen men, guests and servants, in various stages of dishabille, streamed into the room. End of Book 2, Chapter 19. Book 2, Chapter 20 of Red Masquerade. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Annapurna. Red Masquerade by Louis Joseph Vance. Book 2, The Lone Wolf's Daughter. Chapter 20, The Devil to Pay. When it was all over, when the gravel drive no longer crunched to wheels that bore away the man Nogam to answer for his misdeeds, when the household had quieted down, and the most indefatigable sensation-monger had wearied of singing the praises of the Princess Sofia, and, tossing off a final whisky and soda, had paddled sleepily back to bed, lights burned on brightly in 2 parts only of Frampton Court, in the bedchambers tenanted respectively by Prince Victor Vassilyevsky and his reputed daughter. Alone, Prince Victor sat at the desk where he had 4 hours earlier inscribed those characters which should have hurried Nogam into a premature grave. That they had failed of their mission was something that fretted Victor Vassilyevsky, his mind and nerves, to a pitch of exacerbation all but unendurable. What had become of that sentence to death? And what of that other, the telegram which, forwarded by Nogam's hand to Sturm, should long since have set in motion the organized machinery of murder and demolition? Had Nogam, as he had meekly insisted on being questioned subsequent to his subjugation, truly delivered the 2 messages as directed, and, miraculously escaping his fate decreed, returned to Frampton Court by the 12:3, likewise in strict conformance with instructions? This statement Nogam had neglected to amplify, and Victor had been chary of too close questioning, lest it elicit too much in the hearing of others. Once overpowered, Nogam had been philosophic about his bad luck, but the eyes in his face of a stoic had held a gleam that Victor didn't altogether like, a light that seemed suspiciously malicious, a suggestion of spirited humour deplorable to say the least in a self-confessed sneak thief caught in the very act, deplorable and disturbing. In Victor's sight, a look constructively indicative of more knowledge than Nogam had any right to possess. Take it any way you pleased, something to think about. Still more disquieting, Victor thought the circumstance that nobody else had seemed to notice that anomalous light in Nogam's eyes, which of course might mean merely that Victor had worked himself into such a state of nerves that he was seeing things, but equally well that the look was one reserved for Victor alone, intentionally or not, holding for him a message, if he had but had the wit to read it, of particularly personal import. It might have implied, for example, that Victor's half-hearted and paltering distrust of Nogam had all along been only too well warranted, in which case the fat was already in the fire with a vengeance, and Victor's probable duration of life was dependent wholly upon the speed with which he could quit Frampton Court and hurl his motor-car through the night to the lower reaches of the Thames. Envisagement of the worst at its blackest being part of the holy duty of self-preservation, Victor sat fully dressed, with every other provision made for flight at the first flash of warning, only waiting to make sure, and with what impatience was apparent in the working of paste-coloured features, the wincing and shifting of slotted eyes, the incessant shutting and unclosing of tensed fingers. All rested with the telephone that stood mockingly mute at the man's elbow, callous alike to his anxiety and the rancorous regard in which he held it. His call for the house near Queen Anne's Gate had now been in for more than 40 minutes. In that interval he had no less than 3 times pleaded its urgency to the trunk-line operator. And still the muffled bell beneath the desk was dumb, and the worst of it was, fatal though the delay might prove, he dared not stir a hand to save himself until he knew. In the taut torment of those long-drawn minutes, a sound of circumspect scratching was enough to bring Victor to his feet in one startled bound. He stood for a moment, a twitch, but intent upon the corridor door, then composed himself with indifferent success, approached and opened the door. The girl Cho Nu slipped in, offered a timid curtsy, and awaited his leave to speak. "Well, what is it?" "Excellency, the Princess Sofia refuses to let me stay in the room with her." "Why, don't you know?" "I think she means to run away. She would not go back to her bed, but walked up and down, till I ventured to urge her to take rest, when she turned on me in a rage and bade me be gone. Then I came to you." Victor took thought and finished with a dour nod. "You have done well. Return. Keep watch. Let me know if she leaves." "The door is locked, Excellency. She will not let me in." "Spy through the keyhole, then, or hide in one of the empty rooms across the corridor and watch." A muted mutter from the direction of the desk dried speech on Victor's lips. He started hastily toward the source of the sound, midway wheeled, and dismissed the maid with a brusque hand and monosyllable "Go!" then fairly pounced upon the telephone. But all he heard in the course of the ensuing 5 minutes was the voice of the trunk-line operator advising him, to begin with, that she was ready to put him through to Westminster, then maddeningly punctuating the buzz and whine of the empty wire with her call of a talking doll. "Are you there? Are you there? Are you there?" At length, however, the connection was established, and Victor, hearing the falsetto of Cho Nu's second uncle cheerily respond to the operator's query, unceremoniously broke in. "XXII! It is I, number 1, and the devil's own time I've had getting through. Why didn't you answer more promptly? What's the matter? Has anything gone wrong?" "All is well, Excellency, as well as you could wish, knowing what you know." Profound relief found voice in a sigh from Victor's heart. "You got my messages, then? Nogam delivered them?" "So I understand. I myself did not see him, Excellency. The man Sturm—" On that name the voice died away in what Victor fancied was a gasp that might have been of either fright or pain. "Hello," he prompted. "Are you there, XXII? I say, are you there? Why don't you answer?" He paused. No sound for seconds that dragged like so many minutes. Then of a sudden a deadened noise like the slam of a door heard afar, or a pistol shot at some distance from the telephone in the study. Further and frantic importuning of the cold and unresponsive wire presently was silenced by a new voice, little like that of XXII. "Hello? Who's there? I say, that you, Prince Victor?" Involuntarily Victor cried, "Karslake, what gorgeous luck! I've been wanting a word with you all evening." "What has happened? Why did XXII—" "Oh, most unfortunate about him, frightfully sorry, but it really couldn't be helped. If he hadn't fought back, we wouldn't have had to shoot him. You see, the old devil murdered Sturm tonight. For some reason I dare say you understand better than I. We found a paper on the beggar, written in Chinese, apparently an order for his assassination, signed by you. Half a mo. I'll read it to you." But if Karslake translated Victor's message, as edited by the hand of Nogam, it was to a wire as deaf as it was dumb. End of Book 2, Chapter 20. Book 2, Chapter 21 of Red Masquerade. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Annapurna. Red Masquerade by Louis-Joseph Vance. Book 2, The Lone Wolf's Daughter. Chapter 21, Ventre à Terre. With exceeding care to avoid noise, Sofia unlocked the door and for the second time since midnight let herself stealthily out into the darkened corridor, but now with the difference that she did what she did in full command of all her wits and faculties, with no subjective war of wills to hinder and confuse her, and with a definite object clearly visioned, a goal no less distant than the railway station. Lanyard had promised that Karslake should come for her within an hour or two and take her away with him, back to London in the arms of the father, whom, although so recently revealed and accepted, she had already begun to love. If indeed it were not true that she had, in filial sense, fallen in love with Lanyard at first sight, through intuition, that afternoon in the Café des XXII, so very long ago. Well, she might as well await Karslake at the station. It would be simpler. She would be more at ease there, would breathe more freely once she turned her back on Frampton Court and all its hateful associations. Where Victor was, she could not rest. If she had feared the man before, now she hated him. But hatred had added to her fear instead of replacing it. She remained afraid, desperately afraid, so that even the thought of continuing under the same roof with him was enough to make her prefer to tramp unknown roads alone in the murk of that storm-swept night. Though she went in trembling, she felt sure nobody spied upon her going, and in this confidence crept to the great staircase, down to the entrance hall, and on to the front doors. And a good omen it seemed to find these not locked, but simply on the latch. And if the night into which she peered was dark and loud with wind and rain, its countenance seemed kindlier, more friendly far than that of the world she was putting behind her. Without misgivings, Sofia stepped out. It was like stepping over the edge of the universe into the eternal night that bides beyond the stars. Neither did waiting seem to habituate her vision to the lack of sight. Still, the feel of gravel underfoot ought to guide her down the drive to the great gateway, and once outside the park, clear of its overshadowing trees, one would surely find mitigation of darkness sufficient to show the public road. She took one tentative step out of the recessed doorway and into Victor's arms. That they were Victor's she knew instantly, as much by the crawling of her flesh as by the choking terror that stifled the scream in her throat and froze body and limbs with its paralyzing touch. And then his ironic accents. "So good of you to spare me the trouble of coming for you." Before she could reply or even think, other hands than his were busy with her. A folded cloth was whipped over the lower half of her face, sealing her lips, and knotted at the nape of her neck. Stout arms clipped her knees and swung her off her feet, leaving her body helpless in Victor's tight embrace. And despite her tardy recovery and efforts to struggle, she was carried swiftly away, a dozen paces or so, then tumbled bodily in upon the floor of a motor car. The door closed as she tried to pick herself up. The smooth purring of the motor became a leonine roar while she was still on her knees. Gears clashed, and the car leaped with a jerk that drove her headlong against the cushions of the seat. Then the dome light was switched on, and she saw Victor, with a bleak face sitting over her, an automatic pistol naked in his hand. "Get up," he said grimly. "And if there's any thought of fight left in you, think better of it. Remember, your mother paid with her life the price of defying me, and yours means even less to me. Up with you and sit quietly beside me, do you hear?" He lent her a hand that wrenched her arm brutally and wrung a cry, which Victor mocked as Sofia fell upon the seat and cringed back into the corner. For perhaps 30 seconds while the car raced away down the drive, he continued to hold her in the venom of his sneer. Then his gaze veered sharply, and leaning over, he switched off the light. With the body of the car again the dwelling place of darkness, objects beyond its rain-gemmed glass, the heads of the Chinese maid and chauffeur, the twin piers of the nearing gateway, attained dense relief against the blue-white glare of two broad headlight beams, that of the limousine boring through the gateway to intersect at right angles that of another car approaching on the high road, but as yet hidden by the wall of the park. In one breath and the same, the lights of the second car swerved in toward the gateway, and consternation seized hold of Sofia's intelligence and wiped it clear of all coherence. Already the strange lamps were staring blankly in between the piers, and the momentum of Victor's car was too great to be arrested within the distance. The girl cried out, but didn't know it, and crouched low. The horn added a squawk of frenzy to a wild clamour of yells, all prefatory to a scrunching, rending crash in the very mouth of the gateway. A front fender of the incoming car ripped through the rear fender above which Sofia was sitting. Thrown heavily against Victor, then instantly back to her place, she felt the car, with brakes set fast, turn broadside to the road, skid crabwise, and lurch sickeningly into the ditch on the far side. For an interminable time, while the ponderous fabric rocked and toppled, threatened very instant to crash upon its side, the rear wheels spun madly, and the chain-bound tires tore in vain at greasy road material. Without clear comprehension of what was happening, Sofia heard shouts from the other car, now at a standstill, and an oddly syncopated popping. The window in the door on Victor's side rang like a cracked bell, shivered, and fell inward, clashing. With a growl of rage, Victor bent forward and levelled an arm through the opening. From his hand truncated tongues of orange flame, 6 of them, stabbed the gloom to an accompaniment of as many short and savage barks. Then the chains at last bit through to a purchase. The car scrambled to the crown of the road and lunged precipitately away, and the lights of the other dropped astern in the space of a rest between heartbeats. Sitting back, Victor turned on the dome light again, and extracting an empty magazine clip from the butt of his automatic pistol, replaced it with another, loaded. From this occupation he looked up with lips curling in contempt of Sofia's terror. "Your friends," he observed, "were a thought behindhand, eh? When you come to know me better, my dear, you'll find they invariably are, with me." Aftermath of fright made her tongue inarticulate, and Victor's sneer took on a colour of mean amusement. "Something on your mind?" She twisted her hands together till the laced fingers hurt. What are you going to do with me?" "Make good use of you, dear child," he laughed. "Be sure of that." "What do you mean?" "What do you think?" "I don't know." "Really not? But there I think you do injustice to your admirable intelligence." The jeering laugh sounded as he put out the light again. In darkness the derisive voice pursued. "If you must know in so many words, well, I mean to keep you by me till the final curtain falls. As long as it lasts, yours will be an interesting life, I give my word." "And you call yourself my father?" "Oh, no. No, indeed. That's all over and done with. The farce is played out, and while I'm aware my role in it wasn't heroic, I shan't play the purblind fool in the afterpiece. Pure drama, upon which the curtain is now rising. Neither need you. Oh, I'll be frank with you, if you wish. Lay all my cards on the table." A deliberate pause ended in a chuckle. "I have at present precisely 2 uses for my precious little Sofia. She will serve excellently as insurance against further persecution on the part of her accomplished and energetic father, with whom I shall deal in my good leisure, and—but need one be crudely explicit?" Sofia answered nothing to that, and for a long time she said nothing, but sat pondering. And Victor was speedily provided with another interest which engrossed him to the exclusion of further efforts to bait a victim defenceless against his insolence. When, for the third time after that narrow scrape at the gates, the man roused up to peer back through the rear window of the limousine, Sofia heard a harshly sibilant intake of breath between shut teeth, and surmised the discovery that the car which had so narrowly missed blocking their escape had picked up the trail and was now in hot chase. Even youth, however, could distill but slender hope from this. The pace was too terrific at which Victor's car was thundering through the night-bound countryside. It seemed idle to dream that another could overhaul it, even though driven with as much skill and maniacal recklessness. And Sofia returned to thoughts to which Victor's innuendo had given definite shape and colour, if with an effect far from that of his intention. Threatened, the spirit of the girl responded much as sane young flesh will to a cold plunge. She had forgotten to tremble, and though still tense, strung in every fibre, was able to sit still, look steadily into the face of peril, and calculate her chances of cheating it. Presently, in a tone so even it won begrudged admiration, she asked, "Where are you taking me?" "Do you really care?" "Enough to ask."
"But why should I tell you?"
"No reason. I presume it doesn't really matter. I'll know soon enough."
"Then I don't mind enlightening you. We're bound for the continent by way of Limehouse. A launch is waiting for us in Limehouse Reach, a yacht off Gravesend. Oh, I have forgotten nothing. By daybreak we'll be at sea."
"We?"
"You and I."
"You deceive yourself, Prince Victor. I shan't accompany you."
"How amusing! And is it a secret how you propose to stand against my will?"
Sofia was silent for a little, then, "I can kill myself," she said quietly.
"To be sure you can, and when I tire of you, perhaps I'll humour your morbid inclinations, if they still exist."
"You are a fool," Sofia returned bluntly, "if you think I shall go aboard that yacht alive."
"Brava!" Victor laughed and clapped his hands. "Brava, brava!"
He sat up for another look out of the rear window, sucked at his breath even more sharply than before, and snatching up the speaking tube, pronounced urgent words in Chinese. The head of the chauffeur, in stark silhouette against the leading glow, bent toward the tube and nodded rapidly, and to the deep-throated roar of an unmuffled exhaust the heavy car leaped like a spirited animal stung by whip and spur, and settled into a stride to which what had gone before was as a preliminary canter to the heart-breaking drive down to the home stretch. Lights began to dot the roadside. Widely spaced at first, unbroken ranks were soon streaking past the tear-blind windows. Outskirts of London were being traversed, but neither driving sheets of rain against which human vision failed, nor the chance of encountering belated traffic worked any slackening of the pace. Only when a corner had to be negotiated did the car slow down, and then never to the point of sanity. And the turn once rounded, its flight would again become headlong, lunatic, suicidal. The stringed lamps wove a wavering luminous ribbon without end. A breeze laden with the wet fragrance of London drove great gusts of rain in stringing showers through the broken window. Turns and twists grew more frequent, apparently favouring the pursuit. Victor now knelt constantly on the back seat, his face in the fitful play of light and shadow, uncannily resembling that of a hunted jungle cat. On the polished steel of his pistol sinister gleams winked and faded. From his snarling lips foul oaths fell, a steady stream. Black blasphemies spewed up from the darkest dives of the Orient, most of them happily couched in the tongues of their origin and so unintelligible to his one auditor. As it was, she heard and understood enough, too much. Nevertheless, the man was not too completely absorbed.
in watching the shifting fortunes of the race to be unmindful of the girl, and when once she sat up to ease cramped limbs, he misread her intention and, catching her viciously by an arm, threw her back into her corner and advised her not to play the giddy little fool. After that, Sofia was at pains to stir as seldom as possible, and bided her time quietly enough, but never for an instant relaxed her watchfulness or lost heart. The shouldering houses that hedged their course discovered a profile, ragged, black against a sky whose purple dimness held the first dull presage of dawn. In the wild rush of a marauding tomcat, the car crossed a broad public square and sped up the graded approach to a bridge. The smell of the Thames was unmistakable. The far-flung lamps of the embankment were pearls aglow upon violet velvet. Leaving the bridge, the limousine took a turn on two wheels, and immediately something happened. Seemingly some attempt to stop it was made. Vociferous voices hailed it, only to induce an augmented bellow of the exhaust with an instantaneous acceleration of impetus. Then something was struck and tossed aside as a bull might toss a dog. A dark shape whirling and flopping hideously, and an agonized screaming made the girl cower, sick with horror, and cover her ears with her hands. Before she was able to forget those qualms, many more minutes of frantic driving had flung to the rear many a mile of silent streets. Of a sudden she heard an inhuman cry, and, looking up, saw Victor dash the butt of his pistol through the glass, then reversing the weapon pour through the opening a fusillade, whose effect was presumably gratifying, for he laughed to himself when the pistol was empty, laughed briefly but with vicious glee. That laugh levelled the last barrier of doubt and fear, and nerved Sofia finally to test the forlorn hope she had been nursing ever since Victor had let her see a little way into his mind as to her fate. Until he could reload, only the tradition of the sexes lent him theoretical superiority, whereas he was, in fact, a man well on the thither side of middle age, his virility sapped by long indulgence of unbridled appetites, while Sofia was a woman in the fullest flush of her first mature powers. Gathering herself together, she inched forward and made ready to spring, bear him down, overpower him, by some or any means put him hors de combat long enough for her to fling a door open and herself out into the street. With squealing brakes, the car shaved an acute corner and slid on locked wheels to a dead halt, so unexpected that it was Sofia who plunged, floundering, to the floor, while Victor, only by a minor miracle, escaped catapulting through the front windows. The next instant, as Sofia struggled to her knees, the door behind her was wrenched open from without, and at a sign from Victor, rough hands laid hold of the girl and dragged her out bodily. In a passion of despair she lost her senses for a time, and like a madwoman fought, shrieking, biting, kicking, clawing, scratching. With returning lucidity she found herself, panting and dishevelled, arms pinned to her sides, struggling on, for all that, being hustled by some 6 men across a narrow sidewalk of uneven flagstones. Simultaneously the shutter of perceptions snapped, photographing permanently upon the supersensitized film of conscious memory the glimpsed vista of a grim, mean street, whose repellent ugliness grinned through the boding twilight like lineaments of some monstrous mask of evil. Then she tripped on a low stone step, stumbled, and was half carried, half thrown, into a narrow and malodorous hallway. Between her and the sweet liberty of the rain-washed air, a door crashed like the crack of doom. End of Book 2, Chapter 21. Book 2, Chapter 22 of Red Masquerade. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer,
please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Annapurna. Red Masquerade by Louis-Joseph Vance. Book 2, The Lone Wolf's Daughter. Chapter 22, The 7 Brass Hinges. Into a space perhaps 4 feet in width from wall to wall, and 7 deep from the front door to the foot of a cramped flight of crazy wooden stairs, some 10 people were crowded. Sofia and the maid, Cho-Nu, in a knot of excited men. In the saffron glow of an ill-trimmed paraffin lamp smoking in a wall bracket, desperate faces, yellow and brown and white, consulted one another with rolling eyeballs and strange tongues clamorous. Sofia heard the broken rustling of heavy respirations. She saw uncouth gesticulations carve the shadows. Her nostrils were revolted by effluvia of unclean bodies, garments saturate with opium smoke and curious cookery, breath sour with alcohol. 2 were busy at the door, under the direction of Prince Victor, setting stout bars into iron sockets. When they had finished, Victor elbowed them out of his way and thrust back the slide of a narrow horizontal peephole, through which he reconnoitred. The tall, thin body stiffened as he looked, and without turning he flung an open hand behind him and snapped a demand in Chinese. Somebody slipped a revolver into his palm. Levelling it, he sent a volley crashing through the peephole. Yells responded, and in the hush that fell upon the final shot a noise of fugitive feet scraping and stumbling on cobbles. A bullet struck the door, a sounding thump, and all but penetrated, raising a bump on the inner face of its thick oaken panels, and Victor shut the slide and turned back. Subservient silence saluted him. He spoke in Chinese, issuing, Sofia gathered, instructions for the defense of the house. One by one the men designated dropped out of the group about her. 3 shuffled off into a room adjoining the hallway. 2 others ran briskly up the stairs. A 6th, Victor directed to stand by the barred door. His chauffeur and another Chinaman he told off for his personal attendance. The maid, Cho-Nu, was left to fend for herself, and while Sofia could see her, she did not shift a finger from her pose of terror, flattened to the wall. When Sofia came back that way, the girl had vanished, however, nor was she seen again alive. Her arms held fast, Sofia was partly led and partly dragged down the hall, Victor hurrying the group on past the staircase and into a bare room at the back of the house, where a solitary lamp burning on a deal table discovered for all other furnishing broken chairs, coils of tarred rope, a rack of ponderous oars and boat hooks, a display of shapeless oilskins and sou'westers on pegs. The windows were boarded up from sills to lintels. The air was close and dank with the stale flavour of foul tidal waters. Here Victor took charge of Sofia, the chauffeur holding the lamp to light the other Chinaman at his labours, with a trapdoor in the floor, a slab of woodwork so massive that when its iron bolts had been drawn, it needed every whit of the man's strength to lift and throw it back upon its hinges, and its crashing fall made all the timbers quake and groan. Through the square opening thus discovered, Sofia saw a ladder of several slimy steps washed by black oily waters that sucked and swirled sluggishly around piles green with weed and ooze. Down these steps the Chinaman crept gingerly, but halfway paused with a cry, then cringed back to the head of the ladder, yellow face blanched, slant eyes piteous with fear, as he exhibited an end of stout mooring line, whose other end was made fast to a ring-bolt in one of the joists. With a smothered oath, Victor snatched the rope's end from the trembling hand and examined it closely. Even Sofia could see that it had been cleanly severed by a knife. Victor's countenance was ablaze as he dropped the rope. Before the tempest of his wrath the Chinaman bent like a reed, with faint protesting bleats and feebly weaving hands. But in full tide the tirade faltered. Victor seemed to forget his anger, or else to remind himself it was puerile in contrast with the mortal issues that now confronted him.
He turned to Sofia, eyes of cold fire in a wintry countenance. "So," he pronounced slowly, "it appears you are to have your way after all, and more speedily than either of us reckoned. You are to die, and so am I, this day, you in my arms. Well, it is time, I dare say, when I permit myself to be duped and overreached by police spies like your persevering father and lover. Yes, I am ready to pay the price of my fatuity, but not until they had paid me for their victory, and dearly. Come." He motioned to the Chinese to reclose and fasten the trapdoor, and grasping Sofia's wrist with cruel fingers, hurried her back through the hallway. Repeated breaks of pistol fire guided them to the front room. A racket echoed in diminished volume from the street. In an atmosphere already thick with acrid fumes of smokeless powder, two men held the windows, firing through loopholes in iron-bound blinds of oak. At their feet a third squatted, reloading for them as occasion required. As Sofia and Victor entered, one man dropped his weapon and, grunting, fell back from his window to nurse a shattered hand. Releasing the girl without another word, Victor caught up the pistol and took the vacant post. Instantly, on peering out, he fired once, then again. Evidently missing both shots, he settled to await a better target, eyes intent to the loophole. In the course of the next few minutes he changed position but once, when, after firing several more shots, he tossed the empty weapon to the man on the floor and received a loaded one in exchange. Seeing him thus employed, altogether forgetful, Sofia began to back toward the hall, step by cautious step, keeping her attention fixed to Victor throughout, but he seemed to be completely preoccupied with his marksmanship and paid her no heed. Nevertheless, when she at length found courage to swing and dart away through the door, Victor flung 3 curt words to the fellow at his feet, who grunted, rose, and glided from the room in close chase. The guard at the front door was not so busy as Sofia had hoped to find him, not too interested in the progress of siege operations outside to note her approach and look round him from his peephole with a menacing grin of welcome, and his unmistakable readiness, as pistol in hand he took a single step toward her, drove the girl back to the foot of the stairs. Then the other came swiftly after her, and Sofia swung in panic and stumbled up the steps. There were others up above, 2 to her certain knowledge, possibly many more of Victor's creatures, but if only she could find some sort of refuge in the uppermost fastnesses of the rookery, perhaps. Like a shape of smoke wind-driven, she sped up the first flight, then the second, only pausing at the head of the third and last flight to throw hunted glances right, left, and behind her. Overhead, a skylight with dingy panes diffused a dull blue glimmer, which discovered a yawning door at her elbow, a pocket of black mystery beyond, and on the uppermost steps of the staircase her patient yellow shadow, his upturned eyes inscrutable, but potentially revolting with their very concealment of the intent behind them. Impossible that a worse thing could await her beyond that dark threshold. She crossed it in one stride, swung the door to, and set her shoulders against it. Outside she heard the shuffling footfalls pause. The knob rattled, but instead of the inward thrust against which she stood braced, there came the least of outward pulls, as if to make sure that the latch had caught, and after a brief pause a key greater than the lock was withdrawn, and the slippered feet withdrew in turn. When her lungs ceased to labour painfully, she took her courage in both hands and began to explore, groping blindly through darkness, encountering nothing till she blundered into a table which held a glass lamp for paraffin oil like those in use below. Fumbling over the top of the table, she found matches, struck one and set its fire to the wick. The flame waxed and grew steady in a crusted chimney, revealing a room with a slant ceiling and 2 dormer windows, boarded. In one corner a cot bed with tumbled blankets, near this a low wooden stand, with a pipe, spirit lamp, and other paraphernalia of an opium smoker. No chairs, not another stick of furniture of any kind. Removing the lamp, the girl set it on the floor and pushed the table over against the door. By not so long as half a minute would its reinforcement delay Victor when he made up his mind to get in. But in such emergencies the humankind is not impatient of the most futile expedients. There was nothing more she could do. She stood still, listening. The rattle of pistol fire, 3 floors below, continued in fits and starts, but the sound of it was oddly unreal, resembling more stammering explosions of a string of firecrackers than snaps of the whiplash of death. She tried one of the windows without encouragement, but at the other found a board with a loose end, which she pried aside, till through begrimed glass she could see a ghastly weeping sky of daybreak, and, by craning her neck, peered down into the dark gully of the street. At first she thought it empty, but presently her straining vision made out 2 huddled shapes upon the further sidewalk, close under the walls of a public house, whose sign she could just barely decipher, the Red Moon. Then, about to draw back from the window, she saw 5 men, oddly foreshortened figures from that lofty coign of view, leave the Red Moon by one of its bar entrances, bearing between them a heavy beam of wood, and with this improvised battering ram aimed at the door to the besieged house, charge awkwardly across the cobbles. The house spat fire from doors and windows, a withering blast. In the middle of the street the beam was abandoned. 3 of its foolhardy bearers took to their heels, each shaping an individual course, while one lay still upon the wet black stones, and another, apparently wounded in the legs, sought pitifully to drag himself by his arms, inch by inch, out of the zone of fire. But presently his efforts grew feeble. Then he, too, lay stirless, prone in the sluicing rain. The girl shrank back from the window, hiding her eyes as if to blot out that picture. The light, that is to say the absence of it in true sense, the angle of view and the distance, all had conspired to prevent her from making sure that neither her father nor Karslake were of those 4 whose broken bodies cluttered the street. But the fear and uncertainty were maddening. She wheeled suddenly toward the door. The ancient stairs were creaking beneath a measured tread. She made an offer to add her weight to that of the table, but checked and fell back immediately, seeing the folly of sacrificing her strength, the wisdom of saving it to serve her when finally... The creaking ceased. The wards of the lock grated. The knob turned. The door was thrust open, the table offering little hindrance, if any. From the threshold Victor eyed the girl with a twitching grin. "The time is at hand," he announced with a parody of punctilio. "We have beaten them off in the street, but they've found the tunnel from the cellar of the Red Moon and are attacking from the river besides. So, my dear, it ends for us." In silence, shoulders to the wall furthest from the door, Sofia watched him, unwinking. The lamp at her feet painted the tensely poised young body and bloodless face with quaint, stagey shadows. Victor's glance ranged the cheerless room. "I think you understand me," he said. She might have been a waxwork dummy out of Madame Tussaud's. A white blaze of madness transfigured Victor's countenance. He took 1 step towards Sofia, in movements so precisely coordinated that they seemed one and instantaneous. The girl stooped, caught up the lamp, and threw it with all her might. Victor ducked his head. The lamp sailed on, described a descending curve through the open doorway into the well of the staircase, struck, and exploded. In the clutches of the maniac, Sofia was aware of the lurid glare, momentarily gaining strength, that filled the rectangle of the doorway. In through this last, while iron hands tightened on her throat and consciousness grew dark with closing shadows, a man's shape passed, then another. The grip on her throat grew lax. The hands left it free. She reeled, but somebody caught her up and bore her swiftly from the room, leaving 2 who fought together like beasts on the floor, locked in each other's arms, rolling and squirming, rearing and flopping. The scorch of flames stung her cheek, but she forgot that when their broken light made visible the features of Karslake above the arms wherein she lay cradled. Turning aside from the staircase, Karslake bore her to the ladder leading to the skylight, whose broken glass crunched beneath his heels at every step. In the open air he pulled up for a moment's rest, but continued to hold Sofia in his arms. The wind raved about them, buffeted them, tore their breath away. Rain pelted them like birdshot, but they clung to each other and were unaware of reason for complaint. Presently, however, Karslake remembered, and anxiously endeavoured to disengage from these tenacious arms. "Let me go, dearest," he muttered. "I must go back. I left your father to take care of Victor, and—" As if evoked by his very solicitude, Lanyard emerged from the skylight hatch, waved a hand in gay salute, then turned to stare down into the flaming pit from which he had climbed. After a little he fell back a pace. Then, slowly, with the laboured movements of exhaustion, Victor worked head and shoulders through the opening and dragged himself out upon the roof. On all fours he held in doubt, his head moving from side to side like the head of a stricken beast, seeking his enemy with dazzled eyes. Then he made Lanyard out, and pulling himself together for the supreme effort, launched at his throat with the pounce of a great cat. Lanyard met him halfway, caught him in the middle of his bound, wound wiry arms around the man and held him helpless. His voice rang clear above the crackle of flames. "Victor, have you forgotten how you threatened one night 20 years ago to follow me to the very gates of hell, and what I promised you? That, if you did, I'd push you inside. Or did you think I would forget?" He cast the man from him, backward, down into the hungry maw of that inferno. End of Book 2, Chapter 22. End of Red Masquerade by Louis Joseph Vance.